It was well past midnight, and the fire had long since burned out, leaving behind nothing but a faint pile of glowing embers. His breath drifted into the air like mist, his fingers were beginning to lose all feeling, and his body was reaching a point where none of the methods he knew for staying awake were working anymore. Whether he would survive the night depended on a few simple, yet critical decisions he would make before sunrise. By the end of this video, you'll understand what the human body is capable of doing on its own against the cold, and why it was a far more sophisticated survival system than any modern winter jacket. This video is worth watching until the end, because the method we're about to explain is the direct ancestor of a technique that still saves the lives of people stranded in the mountains today. For an ancient human, a freezing night wasn't just uncomfortable. Once the body's core temperature dropped below a certain point, muscle control began to weaken, clear thinking started to fade, and the ability to make good decisions deteriorated rapidly. That's why surviving a cold night wasn't simply about enduring the freezing temperature. It was also about making the right decisions while your mind was still clear enough to make them. The first and most critical step was minimizing heat loss. Ancient humans most likely learned, through painful trial and error, which parts of the body lost heat the fastest. The head, neck, and hands lost heat far more quickly than the rest of the body. Covering these areas was a much more effective strategy than trying to cover the entire body, providing the greatest protection with the limited materials they had. Body position was also surprisingly important for survival. Pulling the knees toward the chest and curling the body into the smallest ball possible resulted in far less heat loss than leaving the arms and legs exposed to the freezing air. This position also helped trap the body's own heat within a smaller space, much like a fundamental principle still taught in hypothermia survival training today. Sleeping in groups was another factor that dramatically increased the chances of survival. When several people slept in close contact, each person passively benefited from the body heat of the others. Ancient groups most likely adopted this habit not because they understood the science behind it, but simply because they noticed they felt less cold when they slept together. It was a completely practical survival habit, shaped by observations repeated across generations. Now, take a moment and think about this. If you had no modern equipment, the fire had already gone out, and all you had around you was open terrain, what would be the very first thing you'd do to survive the night? Would you bury yourself in the ground? Would you look for shelter? Or would you choose to huddle together with a group and wait it out? Share your answer in the comments, because imagining what you would do in that moment reveals just how prepared you feel to face the cold. Contact with the ground was a detail that most people overlooked, but one that ancient humans understood very well. Lying directly on cold ground or stone pulled heat out of the body much faster than the surrounding air ever could. Ancient humans discovered that placing any insulating material, such as dry leaves, bundles of grass, or animal hides, between themselves and the ground was sometimes even more important than covering themselves from above. The wind mattered far more than the temperature alone. Even at the same temperature, a windy night stole body heat much faster than a calm one. Although ancient humans couldn't explain this relationship with scientific terms, they learned through experience that spending a night on an exposed hill was far harsher than spending the same night in a sheltered valley. That's why choosing where to take shelter wasn't just about staying out of the rain. It was also about getting out of the wind's path. Rock formations and natural depressions were valuable shelters for ancient humans because they blocked much of the wind. In some cases, slowly released the heat they had absorbed during the day throughout the night. Sleeping beside a large rock that had been exposed to the sun for hours offered noticeably more warmth than sleeping out in the open. This was most likely practical knowledge that people recognized over and over again and passed along within their groups. The placement of the fire was also far more strategic than most people realize. Ancient humans didn't always build the fire directly beside where they slept. Instead, they sometimes positioned a large rock or a simple barrier behind it so that the heat would reflect back toward them. This simple arrangement directed much more of the fire's warmth toward their bodies, instead of letting it disappear into the open air, much like a technique that is still recommended in modern camping today. The idea of layering clothing was likely discovered by accident, yet it was remarkably effective. Instead of relying on a single thick layer, wearing several thinner layers with pockets of air between them trapped body heat much more efficiently, because the air between the layers acted as an extra layer of insulation. Ancient humans didn't understand the physics behind it, but they likely noticed that wearing several thin animal hides kept them warmer than wearing one thick hide alone. Children and older adults were especially vulnerable during freezing nights, because their bodies were less capable of producing and retaining heat than those of healthy adults. Ancient groups most likely placed these individuals closest to the fire and in the most sheltered positions, giving priority to those who needed the limited warmth the most. This shows that their survival strategy wasn't just about individual endurance, but about the group working together as a whole. If that detail surprised you, the fact that a simple layer of leaves between you and the ground could sometimes be even more important than what you covered yourself with, keep it in mind, because it's a fundamental survival rule that every camper should still know today. Moisture created a danger of its own, separate from the cold itself. Wet animal hides or damp materials pulled heat away from the body far more quickly than dry ones. After rain or snow, ancient humans likely did everything they could to dry their clothing or coverings, sometimes carefully placing them near the fire to reduce this invisible, but potentially deadly risk. Shivering was something most people would see as nothing more than an uncomfortable reaction, but it was actually the body's way of generating its own heat. Muscles rapidly contracted and relaxed to produce warmth, and although ancient humans didn't fully understand the process, they likely sensed that shivering wasn't a sign of weakness, but evidence that the body was actively trying to protect itself. Sleep patterns also had to change completely during freezing nights. Long periods of deep sleep naturally allowed body temperature to drop slightly, which could become dangerous in extreme cold. Some ancient groups most likely developed a watch system, where one person stayed awake to keep the fire alive and watched the surroundings while the others rested. Then they switched roles. It was a practical solution that helped preserve the fire's warmth while protecting the safety of the entire group. Geography and the seasons played a major role in shaping how different groups dealt with the cold. Groups that had lived in colder regions for generations most likely developed thicker clothing techniques, more effective shelter designs, and better ways of managing body heat. In contrast, groups that rarely experienced extreme cold were far more vulnerable when an unexpected freezing night arrived, simply because they lacked generations of accumulated experience in dealing with that kind of danger. Fatigue and hunger were two separate factors that significantly reduced a person's resistance to the cold. The body needed energy to generate heat, and an ancient human who was already exhausted after a long day or hadn't eaten enough was at much greater risk during the same freezing night than someone who was well-fed and well-rested. This invisible factor helps explain why some nights proved fatal for certain individuals, while others experienced nothing more than discomfort. Among the parts of the body most affected by the cold were the fingertips, the nose, and the ears. Blood flow to these areas was automatically reduced as the body tried to preserve its core temperature. Ancient humans most likely learned through painful experience that once these areas began to lose feeling, it was a warning sign that had to be taken seriously. Rather than waiting for the numbness to pass, they learned that warming or protecting those areas immediately could make the difference between survival and disaster. Another important habit ancient humans developed against the cold was finding the right balance between staying still and keeping moving. Remaining completely motionless minimized heat loss, but staying still for too long also meant missing out on the natural heat produced by muscle activity. Through experience, ancient humans most likely learned that making small movements at regular intervals was more effective than remaining completely still. Simple actions like wiggling their fingers or stretching briefly helped keep blood circulating without wasting too much energy. Body fat and overall body build also played a role in cold resistance, although it was a factor completely outside a person's control. Individuals with more body fat had a slight advantage during the same freezing night, because that extra layer acted as natural insulation, while leaner individuals lost heat much more quickly. Even within the same group, this biological difference could explain why two people facing identical conditions experienced the cold very differently, despite no one at the time understanding the reason. Before we finish, there's one more detail worth mentioning. Within a group, people who were especially skilled at building shelters, choosing the right materials, or managing a fire likely earned quiet but genuine respect, because their knowledge could directly determine whether everyone else survived the night. The next time you find yourself shivering on a freezing night, or even when your heating stops working for a short time, remember that ancient humans faced this same basic danger over and over again without modern insulation, heaters, or weather forecasts. They survived not through toughness alone, but through smart choices about where they slept, how they positioned their bodies, how they shared warmth as a group, and the knowledge passed down through generations. More often than not, that accumulated experience was the single greatest advantage that determined whether a group lived to see the morning. If these are exactly the kinds of details you're looking for, then this channel is built around moments like these, the specific instincts and decisions of ancient humans that are usually left out of the story. Stay subscribed and you won't miss the next one.